Friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton, and our next guest is Chris Hedges. He's a veteran reporter of foreign wars, writing for the New York Times since 1990. He has a Master of Divinity from Harvard University. He was part of a team that won the Pulitzer Prize in 2002, and he's the author of the book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you on here. Am I to understand that you've now left the New York Times to teach?
Yes, and I'm writing a book on the Christian right.
Oh, really? What's that going to be called? Do you know the title already?
Yeah, the working title is American Fascism.
Oh, all right. That sounds like a lot of fun. All right, and hey, don't everybody freak out because there's criticisms of the American left in the book too. I read it. So. Well,
the book that I just wrote, Losing Moses on the Freeway: The Ten Commandments in America, is pretty harsh on the institutional church and pretty harsh on Christian liberals. I mean, it's also harsh on the other end of the spectrum as well. But yeah, I think that in many ways, both sort of institutional manifestations of the Christian faith in this society have failed us.
Well, that's very interesting. You said the last one that you wrote is called Losing Moses on the Freeway?
It just came out in June, yeah. It's called Losing Moses on the Freeway, the Ten Commandments in America. And what I did is I took each of the commandments and I used the commandment as a kind of lens to look at American society. I got the idea from the Polish filmmaker Krzysztof Kieślowski, who he did the trilogy Red, White, and Blue that some people may have seen. But he also in 1988 went into a Warsaw housing complex for Polish television and filmed these amazing pieces, each about 60 minutes long, based on the core violation or core issue raised by each of the commandments. They're incredibly powerful cinema. You can get them on DVD, and I've seen them a few times. I've even assigned classes to see them.
Oh, wow, that sounds like a very interesting film. And American Fascism, your new book, is that maybe going a bit too far?
That's the working title.
Working title.
We're not there yet. That's what I'm writing now.
Because, people get really worried about throwing that word around too loosely.
Yes, they do, which is why, in the end, whether we'll put that into the title, I don't know. But I do think that if you look at the core ideology of the Christian right, what it is, I'm talking about the radical Christian right, and what it is they preach, which is really an idolatry of self, a kind of worshiping of American power, a belief that the goals of the American state can somehow express the will of God or do God's bidding, the cult of masculinity, that final aesthetic of apocalyptic violence. These are all classic motifs of any fascist movement, whether it's Italian fascism or German fascism or the Ku Klux Klan, which, the great fascist scholar Robert Paxton argues is our native fascist movement.
Yeah. Well, Paul Craig Roberts calls them the modern-day brown shirts. All right, everybody, it's a weekend interview show. I'm talking with Chris Hedges, author of War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, and we'll be right back.
Son, leave your guns at home, Bill. Don't take your guns to town.
All right, my friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm your host, Scott Horton. My website is weekendinterviewshow.com. I keep all the archives of my interviews up there for you in MP3 format. And also I write for antiwar.com. I have an article up on antiwar.com today called Poisonous Misinterpretations about my interview last weekend with Robert A. Pape, author of Dying to Win, The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism. And there's a bunch of bad news up on antiwar.com today as well, so make sure and go check that out. I'm talking with Chris Hedges. He's the author of quite a few books, actually, but the one I just read is called War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. And before the break, sir, we were discussing the conflation on the part of the American religious right of the nation and their religion and the war. And it's basically, this is something that's kind of a theme throughout your book, is that whatever it is that about you or whatever it is you believe, that during a period of violent conflict, all these things kind of get conflated all together.
Yes, and nationalism is a frightening disease. I've seen it take hold and destroy societies throughout the 20 years that I was abroad covering conflicts from Argentina to the Middle East to the Balkans. It is empowering, it's ennobling, there's a kind of self-gratification in that blind patriotism. There's the ability essentially to suspend individual conscience, maybe even consciousness for the contagion of the crowd, for the excitement of war. But with that self-exaltation comes with it, very dark forces, including the denigration of the other, the belief that others are less human, a complete lack of pathos or pity for those who suffer and who are not like us, who are seen as on the opposing side of whatever conflict we're embracing. War is a poison, and it warps individuals, and it warps societies, and it warps nations. And unfortunately, most religious institutions, or the leaders of religious institutions, are eager to essentially sanctify the cause, and what they create is a kind of civic religion where the symbols of the nation and the symbols, religious symbols, and I'm not just talking about Christianity. I mean, this was done in the Balkans. This was done in the Middle East. These symbols are intertwined with national symbols and take on a kind of frightening potency and danger. And I think we certainly are seeing that process underway in American society.
The yellow ribbon, don't you support the troops?
I certainly do support the troops, which is why I oppose the war. The tragedy, I come from a working class, at this point, not even working class, very depressed town in Maine. Life was centered around the mill, which was shut down. The center of the town I come from, it looks like a bombed out wreck. The stores are boarded over, even the bank is packed up and moved away. Nobody can find work, or very few people can find work that give them a real living wage. People don't have health insurance, and of course, this is fertile ground for military recruiters. They're all over the place. And Maine sends a lot of people in the military. A lot of my relatives have served in the military, and along with other depressed pockets. And meanwhile, I live outside of Princeton, New Jersey. Those who are in the more affluent pockets of the United States remain completely untouched by the war. So I think that this disparity, the fact that, middle class, upper middle class kids are spared, while those who we have really offered the least to are used as our kind of fodder. Those who have, less economic clout, certainly less political clout, less voice in this society, are dying on the banks of the Euphrates, and for what? Is heartbreaking, and certainly in my case personal.
Right, and actually, that was a great answer, but I think you misunderstood my question. I went ahead and let it go because I liked what you were saying, but I was actually just referring to the yellow ribbon magnets all over the place.
No, I know.
With the slogan all over them. Where,
yeah, I know. I knew what you were referring to.
Oh, okay. I thought you misunderstood that I was kind of trying to put you on the spot as not supporting.
No. I react to those ribbons as somebody who spent most of their life in the midst of wars with a kind of visceral even anger, because, there's this misguided notion that somehow supporting our troops means supporting the policy of these war makers and these big corporations like Halliburton, who are, of course, making huge profits off of war. That's nothing new. I mean, that's been going on, for a long time. But I think that these are two very distinct enterprises, supporting our troops and supporting, the occupation in Iraq are two different things.
Sure, and you're not speaking about all this from some ivory tower post in Manhattan. You've actually covered quite a few conflicts. Can you list for me real quickly the different conflicts that you've covered for the New York Times?
For the Times and for other papers, I was abroad for 20 years. I started in Latin America. Was in the war in El Salvador for 5 years. I covered the Contra War in Nicaragua, Guatemala under Rios Montt. Went on and covered the first Palestinian uprising or Intifada in Israel and Palestine. The fighting in the early 90s, the insurgency in Algeria, the Sudan, civil war in the Sudan, Yemen, the first Persian Gulf War, and then went on to cover the war in Bosnia, based in Sarajevo and Kosovo, and then all sorts of side trips, everything from the Sikh rebellion to the Congo to I never counted them up, but I certainly have spent most of the last 20 years in the midst of conflicts, and have reported from 50-plus countries, and I suspect at one time or another been probably in the midst of anywhere from 12 to 15 pretty heavy, violent conflicts, whether internal or whether between nation states.
Well, forgive me for sounding so simple, but why?
Well, motives are never that simple to pin down. Motives are always mixed for everything that we do. Some of those motives are dark and some of them are not. I went to Latin America. I never studied journalism. I went to seminary, and when I was in seminary in the early 1980s, in Latin America, most of the regimes in Latin America were dominated by these rapacious military dictatorships. Pinochet in Chile, the dirty war was underway in Argentina, the death squads in El Salvador were killing between 800 and 1,000 people a month. And, as a great lover of Orwell, I felt that this was as close as my generation was going to come to fighting fascism within my lifetime. And that propelled me into the Latin American conflict, although, again, coming out of Orwell with a great deal of skepticism towards the left, a skepticism towards power, a belief that no matter what their political stripe, those in power should not be trusted, that my job was to give a voice to the victims wherever those victims were. So that idealism pushed me towards the conflict. I went to El Salvador after I graduated from seminary to be a freelance reporter. But at the same time, I got caught up in that sort of high-octane lifestyle of war, that adrenaline-driven lifestyle. War is something, I write in War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, is, I think, the most powerful narcotic invented by humankind. I mean, if you stop and look at what an experience can be like in the midst of a conflict, even in the city of Sarajevo, first of all, you never get enough sleep. You can be zipped out on sort of these wild adrenaline, cocaine-type highs. You see these hallucinogenic landscapes that are beyond the realm of imagination in terms of what shells do to human bodies and how it can distort and change the reality around you. The noise itself is overpowering. You're just assaulted, and the thing is that you're aware in those kinds of frightening situations in ways that you never were before. I mean, you're totally in the presence. There's a kind of Zen-like quality to war. And then at the same time, you can just have these out-of-body experiences where you're just so exhausted and fried and you don't know where you are half the time. I think when you look at that, it begins to replicate what people find in drugs. And the longer you stay in those situations, and of course I stayed in them for a very long time, the harder it is to go back and adjust to life on the outside. Not only do you feel deeply alienated, not only can you not relate or connect to those who are carrying on, life, normal life outside of a war zone, but you yearn for those kinds of highs. You need that kind of adrenaline rush.
Sure.
And that's why so many of us, as soon as a conflict came to an end, we all would be sitting around with a kind of despair trying to figure out how to get to the next one.
Right. A friend of mine's dad, when I was a kid, basically wished every day that he could go back to Vietnam where he could just kill somebody if he felt like it.
Well, it's more complicated than that. It's possible to hate war, yet somehow not be able to live with, miss that experience,
right.
Miss that camaraderie, miss that. So
the intensity.
Yeah, the intensity. I'm not sure, I really do believe that people like that kind of intoxicating power they have, that license to kill with impunity, to revoke another person's charter, to live on this earth, that God-like power to decide.
All right, I'm gonna have to hold you right there, sir. We'll be right back, everybody, with Chris Hedges, author of War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. Welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton talking with Chris Hedges. He's the author of War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. And one of your chapters begins with a quote from Randolph Bourne, "War is the health of the state." And that's the subject I'd like to explore a little bit more here, is the collectivist nature of us versus them, and we and they, and we are people and they are cockroaches, and that kind of stuff.
Well, and even worse than that is, and we're certainly seeing this now, since 9/11 and with the war in Iraq, what Bourne meant is that the state, in a time of war, in the name of national security, in the name of the war effort, is able to take upon itself all sorts of powers and intrusions into our own lives and a diminishing of our own rights as citizens that we would never allow them to do in peacetime. And so the longer a conflict goes on, the more secretive and the more powerful the state becomes. And that's something Bourne, by the way, for those who don't know, was a pacifist, socialist opponent of World War I. Wrote for the New Republic, I think, mostly. Brilliant, and his essays are great. But I think he understood that war itself empowers those elements within the state that could not be empowered otherwise.
Well, and we see that
it begins to put the rest of us at risk.
The House of Representatives just made the Patriot Act permanent.
Exactly. I mean, that certainly would, sort of is the perfect example of Bourne's thesis.
Right. Well, and then also on the, in fact, I want to focus on the name-calling aspect. You sort of brought this up earlier, and it's definitely in the book where you talk about in Bosnia how people who were next-door neighbors for years and years all of a sudden had these ethnic slurs for each other that basically make it okay to kill them.
Well, look, every conflict is presaged by a corruption of the civil discourse. You have to learn how to turn others into objects linguistically before you turn them into objects quite literally, i.e. corpses. It took Slobodan Milosevic, the Serbian nationalist leader, 4 years of hate and filth propaganda pumped through the airwaves that his nationalist party controlled before he got one Serb to cross the border into Bosnia and begin killing Muslims. And I think that, when I look around American society today and I see the way we speak about others, it has this kind of corruption is underway. Not only the way we speak about Muslims, and I think the far religious right is very guilty of this. It's suddenly become okay to brand all sorts of people, including people within our own society, people, this whole campaign against gays and lesbians, the attacks against secular humanists. And when you listen closely to what it is they're saying, and I encourage all of your listeners to take time to listen or watch the broadcasts from some of these far-right wing Christian extremist groups, they're not just saying that, this ideology or this stance is not legitimate, which of course they are. They're saying that it's satanic, that it's demonic, that these are, forces essentially set out to destroy Christian America. That kind of talk, which echoes very much the kind of talk that I used to hear in the Middle East, or certainly here in the Balkans, is very, very dangerous. It's not benign, because what it is essentially allowing us to strip others, even within our own society, and then certainly outside our society, of dignity and human worth. And when we begin to talk that way, after a while we begin to act that way. So language is extremely, extremely important, and these cliches and aphorisms and, the jingoistic phrases that are sort of pumped into our living rooms by the cable news networks, the war on terror, axis of evil, this kind of stuff, begins to affect the way we think. And in many ways we're robbed of language. Whatever disquiet we may feel about this, once we begin to speak about it by using phrases like the war on terror, we're already sort of trapped within their box. And it's hard to think outside the box.
It reminds me of George Orwell in 1984. Each edition of the dictionary that comes out has fewer and fewer words in it.
Yeah.
So that you don't have the ability to think around the situation that they set up.
Yes. I think, again, Orwell got it. I mean, Orwell certainly understood totalitarianism and how that these kind of movements exist within all societies, even, of course, open democratic societies.
And, it's funny because here in America, I grew up with the whole sticks and stones can break my bones and that kind of thing. And since it's generally a pretty peaceful society when we look out our window anyway, usually we're killing people overseas somewhere, but we tend to really not take that kind of thing too seriously. But, just in the last week I watched the movie Hotel Rwanda, where this ethnic difference between the Tutsis and the Hutus that didn't even really exist, that basically these guys on the radio are just saying the Tutsi cockroaches, the Tutsi cockroaches over and over and over again, where these people aren't humans anymore. Now, your mama taught you it's not okay to kill a human, but if he's a cockroach, well, you got to step on one of those.
And that is, if they had just shut down the radio station in Kigali, they might have been able to stop a genocide.
Yeah, well, and they'll use that same excuse to shut down this one, I guarantee it. All right, y'all. We'll be right back. It's the Weekend Interview Show. I'm talking with Chris Hedges. He's the author of War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. Welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton, and I'm talking with Chris Hedges. He's the author of War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. And on the bottom of page 73, sir, you write, a soldier who is able to see the humanity of the enemy makes a troubled and ineffective killer. To achieve corporate action, self-awareness, and especially self-criticism must be obliterated. We must be transformed into agents of a divinely inspired will, as defined by the state, just as those we fight must be transformed into the personification of unmitigated evil. There is little room for individuality in war.
War is the great corporate enterprise. It's the, we give up our individuality for this kind of comradeship, which is the opposite of friendship, and I think often mistaken for friendship. We become part of the herd.
Is the opposite of friendship? What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, friendship is about self-awareness, self-possession, self-criticism, through the eyes of the friend, when we have a friend. And I think, if if we stop and we're honest with ourselves, most of us have very few friends, deep on a deep level, and some of us perhaps only one or two. Friends don't love self-sacrifice and war the way comrades do. But in wartime, or certainly when you embrace this kind of comradeship, you are required to live essentially as a corporate entity, as one body with a common goal and a common purpose. And you have a kind of feeling, I think it's a false kind of feeling of equality. You have a kind of feeling that you're one of a whole, of an entity. But what you need is that external threat, that external danger to create that feeling, that warmth of comradeship, that sense of belonging. In some ways, when you go to war, it's easier to face death in war because you face death as a group rather than facing death alone. But after those wars end, after that conflict ends, after soldiers come back for combat, they look around and, of course, all of their comrades have become strangers to them. And you fall into a kind of despair. I think that oftentimes when soldiers or Marines have a kind of nostalgia or longing for a war, it's not so much the violence. Very few people actually relish killing. They may be intoxicated by it and driven by it, but I think what they long for is that kind of comradeship, that sense of belonging that they can spend the rest of their lives never finding again. But it is not friendship. Friends don't love sacrifice the way comrades do. I mean, for friends, dying is hard and bitter because that dialogue that you have and cherish, not only will you lose, but you never will be recreated. Whereas in a society or in a culture of comradeship, it's all about sacrifice. It's all about death. It essentially becomes a culture of death rather than life.
When you talk about the kind of feeling of belonging, there's a great example in your book of, and this is really one of the great things about this book, is this isn't just, written from sitting in the middle of Texas like it would be if I wrote it, but you were actually there when all of these terrible things happened. And one of these stories is about the war over the Falkland Islands, where the people of Argentina, who absolutely hated their fascist dictatorship, became its biggest cheerleaders for 3 days and then went back again?
Well, I was in Argentina 2 weeks before they invaded the Falklands, and we had the largest anti-government demonstration since the junta had taken power. I mean, the whole center of Buenos Aires was shut down. We were attacked with water cannons, mounted police. I think 7 or 8 people were killed. People were badly beaten, tear gas, CS gas. And then they invaded the Falklands. And here was this junta, which had been responsible for the disappearance of 30,000 of their own citizens, robbed the country, turned it into an international pariah. They were hauling opposition leaders and labor leaders out of prison, still with a visible markings of the beatings on their faces. And, they go on TV and applaud the invasion of the Falklands, or what the Argentines called the Malvinas. And I was a very young kid, but it was a really important lesson for me because I understood the danger of nationalism. To express any opposition, not only to the war, but to the glorious military junta that was now leading us in this great enterprise, especially the foreigner, was to court physical violence. And when you looked around the city, there, were about a handful of people that spoke with any kind of sanity. And that was, I never forgot that lesson, and I saw it repeated over and over again with this kind of nationalist intoxication and what it does to rational, logical thought, which is essentially destroy it.
Well, and also you give special attention in the book to those people who are determined to stay sane and to stay reasonable and to not the ones who refuse to deny their enemies' humanity, and how they are always so marginalized and so ignored.
Yeah, I mean, look, in wartime one sees a lot of physical courage. One doesn't see very much moral courage. And And you have to understand that those two things are very different. But those people who do stand up, because of course moral courage means that you accept the possibility of being pushed outside the crowd. That those heady, intoxicating, and nationalist goals, when you defy them, mean that you no longer have a place within the group or even within the nation. And this kind of moral courage is deeply impressive, and I certainly write about several people throughout the book who I saw do that. But I think it's important to remember that not only are they sort of reviled and ostracized in the midst of the conflict, but even after the conflict, because their very presence serves as a reminder for how the kind of complicity that societies had in, often, murderous campaigns in the case of Bosnia of genocide. And it's a lonely, difficult road to follow, and one that entails a lot of risk and a lot of solitude. But these are, of course, the people that give us hope and finally are able to rebuild the bridges to knit societies back together.
Well, and in fact, that touches on something else that you write about, is the hijacking of memory, and how I think you said in Austria they have a big museum about World War I, but they don't even have a World War II exhibit whatsoever.
Yeah,
they just kind of want to forget that ever happened, huh?
Yeah, it was a remarkable moment. I think there were 1 million Austrians who died, and there's no museum to the war at all. I think the Germans have been much better about dealing with that legacy than the Austrians have. But when you can't deal with it, if you look at, for instance, the Cypriot Turks and the Greek Cypriots, or you look at what's happening in Bosnia, a society can't go forward. They have, those factions or groups within a society have no way to speak to each other. And again, we get back to the issue we spoke about earlier of language. If you look at the South African apartheid conflict, the brilliance of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, although they gave, of course, amnesty to the torturers and killers of the apartheid regime, they forced them to explain, or in great detail, the crimes that they committed. And what they gave white and black South Africans was a common language, was a way that they could communicate. If you look at Bosnia now, you have ethnic Croat, and Muslim children, when it comes time to learn their histories, and oftentimes within the same school, going off and learning separate histories that are often diametrically opposed. And of course, what that does is that you have no common language by which you can go forward to make peace. You don't have peace in a place like Bosnia. You don't have peace in Cyprus. What you have is the absence of war, and that's very different.
And in fact, in Bosnia, you really go to lengths to describe how they deliberately changed their language apart after the breakup of Yugoslavia, where all these people were neighbors and looked alike, and their language, at least spoken out loud, was basically all the same, and how when Yugoslavia broke up into its different pieces, the governments basically tried to come in and purge the language of the foreign terms.
Yeah, well, it's why Freud wrote that fratricides were always the bloodiest conflict. It's that, that those nuances and minor differences that have to be inflated to a tremendous degree to create the kind of conflict that the nationalist warlords wanted to create. And I think the other thing is that when those conflicts begin, they are particularly bloody because there is a kind of absurd quality to it. Linguistically, racially, ethnically, Bosnian, Serb, Muslims, and Croats, you couldn't tell the difference. As a matter of fact, after the NATO bombing, crossing central Bosnia with the Bosnian Fifth Corps, and the lines would get all mixed up, and you couldn't tell who was who. So you have to, atrocity becomes a way by which you can create these chasms or splits within societies that weren't there before.
Now,
and I think that Freud was onto something.
Now, that is really fascinating concept right there. This war that basically started just because some thug warlords decided they wanted to get rich at everybody's expense and have some bloodshed, that they basically precipitated some of the worst slaughters in order to reinforce the splits that were really artificial.
I think that, I'm not a great believer that the war in Bosnia, was based on, as Robert Kaplan said, ancient ethnic hatreds, and I don't believe it. It was a completely manufactured war, and it took the world leaders who played off of each other. I mean, Tudjman in Croatia needed a Milosevic in Belgrade, and Milosevic needed a Tudjman. I mean, they, what you do is you destroy the center. And I think that, the tragedy of the Middle East, if you look at Israel, where I spent several years, is that, Hamas needs a Sharon and Sharon needs a Hamas. And all of those people who don't really want to live like that, get sort of swept aside. And I think that when, extremists, and I think we certainly are seeing extremists infiltrate our political system, they're always a minority. And they need the extremists on the other side to play off of. But the rest of us, essentially, as the conflict goes on or the society disintegrates, are left caught completely in the middle and voiceless.
Do you think that the United States is at this point too far along into the war on terrorism to turn around and come back anytime soon? We're going to have to see this thing through till every Muslim is dead?
Well, the society has certainly been grossly distorted. Our policies in the Middle East, of course, are just dumping gasoline all over this conflict, unfortunately. And I was in the Middle East after 9/11. I was covering Al-Qaeda for the New York Times. There was a tremendous amount of empathy and sympathy, and I'm talking about within the Muslim world, for what we underwent as a country in 9/11. And if we had only built on that empathy, I mean, the successful fights against extremist or terrorist groups must have as their goal the isolation of those groups within their own societies. And that's, essentially why that war becomes much more of an ideological than a conventional military war. Unfortunately, we never built on that empathy. We folded in on ourselves. We turned against everyone, even Europeans who, European democratic states that shared our values. I mean, if you go back and remember the way we spoke about the French, who I will remind your listeners were correct. There were no weapons of mass destruction, no links with Al-Qaeda, and they were not trying to reconstitute their nuclear weapons program. But how did we react? We denigrated French culture. We denigrated French history. In short, we became racist. And racism is always the flip side of nationalism. And that entire process alienated not only, of course, many of our friends in Europe, but huge swaths, perhaps most of the Middle East, especially once the invasion of Iraq began. And that, as somebody who's had to cover extremist groups and the successful sort of fight against them in some cases and less successful fight in other countries, was really heartbreaking because we really went right down the path that these, violent extremist groups wanted us to go down.
And this whole thing really could have been diffused pretty quickly. I remember seeing pictures in the foreign media of, as you said, people even in the Gaza Strip were crying for us on September 11th. And we're saying, that's just going way too far. You can't just go and do that. And we just went and turned around and stuck it right back in their face. So you're going to call us an empire? We'll show you.
We started dropping iron fragmentation bombs all over the place.
Yeah.
And then, of course, just bungled everything with, we had Osama bin Laden and Tora Bora and they escaped. And, it was just so mismanaged and so poorly run. It's just, I'm pretty hard-headed about this. I don't think that these people are going to be converted. And it's a war of intelligence. It's not a conventional war, but it's certainly a war that has to be fought. But we've just been a complete disaster. And I really worry that, we're not only going to pay for it, and we are paying for it in terms of, turning ourselves into a kind of international pariah. But, I suspect, or, certainly with every intelligence chief I ever interviewed, is certain that we will again suffer acts of probably catastrophic domestic terrorism on American soil. And that's when I really worry. I think that these extremist elements within the Republican Party, who've largely captured the Republican Party, may then use that to really distort American democracy into something that we have not seen before. I think that as long as they need a crisis in order to justify those kinds of draconian measures. I think without a crisis, we can sort of stave them off. But if the society lurches into that kind of instability, then I think we're deeply in trouble, because we have very powerful forces that have a great deal of antagonism to the liberty and openness that has largely characterized our society, as imperfect as it is, and with, of course, our legacy of intolerance and slavery and acts of genocide and everything else. But I mean, that has certainly been a feature of American society, and that feature could be destroyed.
Right. As Thomas Jefferson said, let him be wrong as long as reason is left free to combat the mistake. All right, everybody, we're talking with Chris Hedges. He's the author of War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, and we'll be right back to wrap up after this break. Friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton, and I'm wrapping up with Chris Hedges, author of War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. It's an excellent portrayal of the myths, really a debunking of the myths of the war culture. And it's especially good because Mr. Hedges has covered, near a dozen violent conflicts all over the world, and uses examples from all of those very different conflicts to make his points. And a good example of that, I think, is you talk about in the book, sir, ulterior motives. There's always ulterior motives. It's never what they really say. And one of the examples that they used was when the Intifada started, that it was partly a class war within Palestinian society against the merchants and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, when you cover conflict, you often realize that the stated or public goals are very different from what's actually taking place on the ground. And I think the other thing you realize is that, if you're not in the midst of a war, it's easy to talk about it as if it's surgical and quick. And these are terms that don't apply when you're in the midst of a war. I mean, once you employ that kind of violence, it opens up a whole Pandora's box of movements and actions which you can no longer control. You're hanging on by the end of the tail. And when the first Palestinian uprising, or Intifada, began, which was largely generated by, young kids in the refugee camps in Jabalia and Han Yunis, places like that in Gaza, there was, along with it, a kind of class war against the middle-class Palestinians, the shop owners. That's why they constantly had these closures, because they wanted to seize political power and economic power from the more conservative, more traditional, older elite and pass it on to a much more younger and radical elite. This was, of course, when Hamas was a very small group. It's so small that the Israelis, when they would go in and do sweeps, generally left Hamas alone because they thought it was a nice way to break up the sort of monolithic control that Yasser Arafat's Fatah had over the Palestinians. This was something that, of course, I think has come back to haunt Israel. So, yes, there are always many things going on in a war. Certainly, very rarely, the reasons told for a war happen to be the reasons by which we are fighting a war. I mean, I remember being in a slum in Cairo after the first Persian Gulf War, which I covered for the New York Times, and then was with the Shiite rebels in Basra during the uprising until I was captured, taken prisoner by the Iraqi Republican Guard. But when I was released and went back to Cairo and was sitting around with a bunch of young Muslims looking at the war and talking about the war with them, looking at the war through their eyes, and a great deal of hostility, it became clear to me that the message that we as a nation had sent to the rest of the world, we who, of course, consume 25% of the world's petrol, are the major sort of producer of greenhouse gas emissions. The message we sent was, we have everything, and if you try and take it away from us, we'll kill you. And I think that message that was sent out to the poor of the world got much closer to understanding the truth of the war and the belief that we have a right to control the world's petrol than talking about restoring legitimate rule to Kuwait and the tyranny of Saddam Hussein. Not that Saddam Hussein was a horrible tyrant.
Oh, well, I sure wish we had another hour, because I still have pages and pages of questions for you here. But I can recommend everyone, please go out and get War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning by Chris Hedges. It's a very important book. Definitely belongs on your shelf. Thank you very much for your time today, sir.
Thank you, Scott.
All right, everybody, we'll be back next week with the Weekend Interview Show. Check out my new article. It's up on antiwar.com today, Poisonous Misinterpretations. See you next week.